Hello again, and welcome to another episode of What's the Plan, a public access TV show where we bring community leaders, both public and private, to the table to discuss how they view where our community is going and what the plan is to address the issues that we're going to be facing in the short and long term. Tonight, I should say today, we have a guest who represents what most people think about when we say planning at the municipal level, and that is Lee Hartman, our planner, our land use planner, and the Director of Planning and Development for the town of Plymouth. Lee, how are you today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Great. Now, I should say that when I was chairman of the planning board, Lee and I had an interesting relationship. Lee always thought that I was his boss, and I never thought that I was his boss. Lee supports and helps the planning board, the zoning board of appeals, and many other agencies and departments in the town. Lee, you want to describe a little bit what is under your umbrella? Because I don't think many people realize how much you do.
Sure. So we have the Office of Planning and Development, and that includes a little bit of economic development, which we share with the Economic Development Foundation. We do all the tourism, event scheduling, tourism coordination on the town side, again, partnering with the Chamber of Commerce or Destination Plymouth. We have an Office of Community Development, which deals with housing rehabilitation programs. We have Conservation Commission and the work they do through protecting our conservation resources. The Planning Board, the Zoning Board of Appeals, the Historic District Commission, Design and Review Board, and we also provide a fair amount of support to the various steering committees in the town. Some support to the Open Space Committee too, and Energy too. We support the Energy Committee in the town of Plymouth.
So from that description, you clearly have your hands on a lot of very current issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis in the town, whether it be economic, land use, or the like. I ask this general question to open most episodes of the show of each of my guests. Within your discipline, and in your case it's not such a narrow discipline, but within your discipline and in your responsibilities, what are the short and long-term issues facing Plymouth, and what are the strategies to address both? And I realize that's a very encompassing question, so it may take us the whole day to talk about it, but.
So residential growth has always been a challenge to the town of Plymouth. I think having balanced growth and growth is a good thing for the community, but in a town like Plymouth, where I think we've probably been the fastest growing community for the last 30 years, there have been other towns that have been for 1 or 2 or 3 years faster than us, but if you look at the last, say, 30 years, Plymouth has grown probably faster than any other community in Massachusetts, and we continue to grow. And that's because it's a great location, people love to live here, and we have a lot of undeveloped land in the town. So I think long-term and short-term, as it has been for the last 30 years, how we deal with that residential growth and how we deal with the impacts of that residential growth will always be probably one of the most important, critical things we deal with as a community. I think also for long and short term I know it's not retail, but the commercial, industrial type development in the town is very important. As we see the new schools come on board, we talk about the merits of a new town hall and all the other things we do as a municipality, the need to provide some additional funding resources to help provide resources to function and to minimize the cost of taxpayers is very important. So I think another critical thing that we as the planning department and the planning board will be dealing with is how do we encourage or find other ways to provide taxes to the town that's not at the expense of the taxpayer itself, that we provide some additional tax funds from other development. I think what goes hand in hand with that is how do we provide quality jobs to the town of Plymouth. So as we talk about high-tech uses, office uses, medical uses, those are the types of things we'd like to encourage in the community. It's equally as important to try to provide those so we have quality jobs for the residents of the town of Plymouth too. So I think that balancing of residential and commercial development is a real challenge in the town. The second thing, although it's not my primary role, it's really the Department of Public Works, is how do you deal with the impacts of those on water, sewer, and traffic? In many cases, as you know well, one of the biggest topics we deal with when a development comes forward is how we deal with those traffic impacts. And so that's another critical one. Also, right now, we look at our aquifer protection. All of our water that we have for drinking water comes within the boundaries of the town of Plymouth, and it comes from one source, which is the Plymouth Carver sole source aquifer. So how we make sure that we protect that water quality for current and future generations is also something that we've spent a lot of time looking at. We've recently revised all of our aquifer protection bylaws, and we're doing, I think, a much better job of regulating uses that go within those aquifer protection zones. The Department of Public Works, working with us to some degree, have also looked at a master plan to identify where new wells should be and steps we should be taking to protect those wells. So I think that's also critical. When I look at our other parts of what I do in my department, tourism. We know, and we recently did a kind of quick and dirty estimate. We believe that tourism brings about $350 million a year, each and every year, to the town of Plymouth. It's probably our number one economic engine in Plymouth, tourism. So we really want to focus on how we provide and encourage and nurture that business sector in the town, and what we can do to encourage not just the current tourism that we have, but additional, especially as we start to look at 2020 and the celebrations we plan for Plymouth's 400th anniversary. So tourism, again, is a very critical piece, I think, of short-term more than long-term, but it always has, and because of our historic identity, a very important part of what we would do for goals. When we look at Conservation Commission, we have the current more and more frequent storms. We have threats and concerns about sea level rise. So as we look at those things, I think, and this is probably a little more on the longer term side than short term, how we deal with what we will anticipate being more damage to our coastal areas, more requests for additional revetments and barriers to protect those properties, how we balance the need to protect private property against the natural processes that occur and will occur, have occurred for thousands of years and will continue to occur. And that trying to, again, strike that balance between protecting property but also allowing nature to take its course. I think as in 10 or 15 years we become more and more of a critical function in the debate that will occur in the community. Community development, we continue to try to provide funding to families who have low or moderate income to do critical repairs of their houses. So if there's a code violation in those houses and they income qualify, we have a range of programs we can offer to help upgrade those life safety issues in a home. So I think when we look at the goals of what we're doing, and again, as you say, I could probably go on forever about it, but those are probably some of the more important ones that we're focusing on right now.
Well, I think you did a great job of telling the folks what your responsibilities are, and they're incredibly encompassing, which speaks to Plymouth's dedication to trying to handle a lot of these issues, but also speaks to the fact that as we grow, your department is going to have needs, human resource needs, to continue to address the issues that come up. For example, Patrick Farrer is the energy officer. 15 years ago, we didn't ever conceive of a person dedicated to energy, or the new energy, the sustainable, the green energy. So these are issues, and you have such a broad sweep that I think it's important for the residents to understand that. You brought up many good points, but the two that hit me early on, and I think it's something that maybe if you could speak a little bit more to, but I will certainly identify, is Plymouth has a lot of land and a lot of available land. It may not be great land. We talk about marginal land in our world, land that has issues associated with it. But if you have enough money, the issues can be overcome. So I think that we have to be, I'd like you to speak a little bit on where you think we need to go in terms of the balance of using land and saving land, because a lot of people say, oh, well, we're always buying land. Well, there's a reason why we're buying land. The second point that I think is very interesting, and I don't think a lot of people make this connection, and I plan on having Jonathan Bader on a future show, but the director of public works in the town of Plymouth is a different position than the director of public works in, let's say, an Abington or Brockton or a Framingham, which are towns that are largely built out. This town is largely not built out. And by virtue of that, Jonathan, or JB, is almost like another planner.
Yes.
And there has to be, and I think there is, to a great extent, a communication between your discipline of planning and development and his discipline of planning and infrastructure, and then in parentheses, and how it affects development. Because every time JB and his department improves infrastructure someplace, it opens up land to cheaper, easier development by minimizing those things that make land marginal.
Right.
So can you speak to those?
Sure. We work very closely with DPW right now, either on project reviews. For example, right now the planning board's looking at the Revere Copper and Brass site for a redevelopment, and we've had, I think, 3 meetings already coordinating between the utilities side and the public works side and the planning side. So when we look at day-to-day activities, we're very good about having those meetings. We have another one scheduled for 2 new developments that just came in for next week. So yes, when we look at case-by-case basis, a lot of coordination. We could do a better job. We're constantly working on that, but there's already a fair amount of coordination between what the permitting side does as with the DPW side. Long term, the DPW has been really good of including me in the wastewater master plan project that's ongoing, the water master plan work. So as they start to look at their plans and their facility plans, Burial Hill, a very important historic facility in Plymouth, we've worked hand in hand on the renovation plans that are moving forward on that. So yes, it's interesting because they cover the kind of what happens on the public domain, and my department and the planning board, the zoning board of appeals, covers what happens kind of on the private property, and a lot of that is how you make those two interact, and it is a very critical piece. As you talked earlier about land, and I think that's a good point to bring up, I think as you look at a town of Plymouth with so much undeveloped land, and in some cases people will come to me and say, well, why don't you just say no? And I think I said it fairly recently at a planning board meeting, I like to remind people that there is a constitutional right to enjoy your property, which for better or worse means to develop on it or to improve it. So the laws are very clear, especially in Massachusetts. We have some of the worst zoning laws that we work on in the United States, but they're very clear that says if you own property, you have a right to reasonable use of that property, and the town can only impose reasonable regulations. They can't just say no.
I don't mean to cut you off, but you just hit it. I think the language speaks to reasonable economic gain from private property owned. I mean, I think that's, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting, but that's the language used. And the key is economic gain and reasonable. So from a standpoint of land use protection, you can't just say no.
Right.
But by the same token, you can't be accused of being unfriendly to the user if you're, as a regulator, which the planning board is, and the ZBA is, and other boards in town, Conservation Commission, when the determination is based on reasonability,
Right.
that's a word, you know, that's where that's where it becomes gray, and that's where the negotiation takes place. And we can't do linkage to do offset, so we have to get into a negotiative process by which we, as a board or a commission, try to make a use, a constitutional granted use, more reasonable. And that's the fine balance, and a lot of folks don't understand that. That's what we live in. We live in gray.
Right.
We don't live in black and white. And the grays have become more gray in the 21st century than they were in the early 20th century.
And the second part of that goes hand in hand with what we do on the permitting side is how we protect land too. And I don't think we want to minimize the impact of the Community Preservation Committee and the good work and the important work they do in the community. And so the land acquisitions that they acquire and the land that they are protecting in the town, again, it's very essential because if you don't want something to happen on it, the only way to do that is to buy it yourself. So I think when we look at development and say, okay, we want and we recognize some development will occur, how do we balance that? And the CPC is a great tool. They do a great job of leveraging that money with state and private grants from nonprofits. The other thing I think that's very important to point out is when we look at what the planning board does, and we have a number of different tools that we use there where we allow development, but on a smaller footprint and protect open space. So although the development is
Meaningful open space.
Meaningful open space, yeah. So, as we look at what the planning board does, when we acknowledge development happens, is there a better way to do that? And if we have to let development to occur and we want it to occur, how can we do something that also provides some other benefits? And I think the last time I looked, we've created about 3,500 acres of permanently protected open space through the various development tools that the planning board has. So I think you look at development and say, can we do it smarter? Can we do it while still protecting some open space? And then we look at the CPC and say that that's an important tool also.
Well, it's interesting because I always look at there's public open space and there's private open space, and I think that it's important we're always talking about balance, and the taxpayers can't always be buying the land to protect. And I think it is very important for boards like the Planning Board or the ZBA or the Conservation Commission to look at land that is privately held and allow, and you said cluster, whether it's cluster development or it's our agricultural uses.
Right.
Because when you look at a typical cranberry bog, their production acreage is relatively small even after the big price crisis of 10, 15 years ago. Their production area is relatively small to the land that they own.
Yes.
And their land that they own is generally natural, largely unaltered woodland.
With great views.
With great views, yes. The old timers were smart when they laid these out. And of course, the requirement of being low to the water means that land is elevated, so they're looking over lowland, so they get those views. But it's very important to have the private landowners also steward land, because the town, every time we buy land in the public domain, the town or the public entity that buys it becomes the steward. And when you're a steward, there are ops costs, there are maintenance costs associated with it. So you have to look at that balance. There's some things you have to buy publicly, but there's some things that as a board you have to look at and say, that's meaningful open space. And that's the second, the second comment. I mean, I cut in there for a minute, but the term meaningful has a broad range of definitions, because there is open space that is recreative.
Right.
If
that's a word.
Yes, that is a word that we use in consulting. Okay, it's in the consulting lexicon. But there's recreation land that is open space, and that is not to be considered the same as conservation land.
Right.
So you can't just slap conservation restrictions, because the thresholds to achieve a conservation restriction may not be a golf course, and vice versa. So when we say open space, that's a very, very broad term in the regulatory world. On the street, open space means woods, wildlife protections, but to us, open space it's either developed open space or undeveloped open space, and they have differences. And again, zoning defines what those things are.
Right. We should also point out we have the Wildlands Trust of Southeastern Mass and the Nature Conservancy in particular, and the trustees for reservation in Plymouth. All three groups are also, again, they're not private, they're not public, but they do a great job of protecting resources.
They steward a lot of purchased
it.
land. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit, because I know this is something that you have been working on longer than I, but certainly I've helped along the way. We have a zoning review of our bylaw, and can you speak a little bit to that and
Sure.
share with the audience what we're trying to achieve there?
Sure. So our bylaw was adopted in 1972, and from what I can see, we probably have amended it 400 or 500 times since it was adopted. We've never ever looked at how each of those amendments relate to the original document overall. We've never looked and said, is this bylaw now current? For example, right now our bylaw says that home daycare facilities require a special permit. But the state has changed that a number of years ago to say that no, that's not a special permit type of use. So there are things in our bylaw that aren't consistent with the state law. There are things in individual sections that are not consistent with each other. And the thing is just plain too big, too. It's a massive document. We used to joke at one point when somebody said to us, well, how do you control growth in Plymouth? And the answer was, well, we made our bylaw so complex that nobody can figure it out. So what we're doing now is taking a look at that bylaw and saying, okay, now that we've done all these amendments, we adopted it in '72, let's take a look at it and see what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, how can we make it a more usable document, how can we make permitting maybe a little easier, and what are the things we just need to do that reflect the current way of thinking when it comes to land use, and law. Case law or law for zoning often is determined by the courts. And as different court cases come up, you want to make sure that your bylaw reflects the most recent case law out there too, so that you have a defendable bylaw, so when you make decisions, they're defendable in court too. So we're looking at, I think it's the next meeting in January, where we have a presentation coming through from town council on the progress that they've been doing. We haven't had a lot of comment ability yet because we don't have a draft or draft sections or something to respond to, but I do expect that within the next few weeks, and we'll be looking for feedback from the community on the changes that are coming forward.
As the individual who kind of oversees and directs the stewardship of the bylaw, which I think the planning department does. Simply put, tell the audience what zoning is.
So I always like to say that zoning is a law of minimums. So, and oftentimes people, I'll say, well, I like 10 trees, and I think there should be 10 trees in front of everybody's house. But then you have to say, what's the minimal acceptable? Well, maybe it's really 5 trees. And so your bylaw really says, what are the minimum standards that we can feel protect, and the term we use is the health, safety, and welfare of the residents. So what a bylaw does is says, here's certain things that we want to impose, how many parking spaces you have to have, how high your building can be, how far you should be set back from property lines. It sets those kinds of standards. And then it also says, in these certain parts of town, and they could be in a commercial zone, a residential zone, they could be in an area that floods, for flood zones, act for protection, we have a whole set of standards that say, here are the types of uses you can do here are the types you can't do. Here are the types that might be okay, but to say they're okay, we want you to go before the planning board or the zoning board of appeals for review. So the bylaw itself really just kind of sets the framework, the legal framework for saying how things can to be developed and where they can be developed.
And that is, and I agree with everything you said, and that's kind of a crux of what we have identified. I think I can include you in this. We use zoning as a planning document, and zoning is really a reactive document. Right. And there's great debate in town by various entities as to that very philosophy. Zoning is minimums. Zoning tells you what you can do at a minimal level, and moreover tells you what you can't do.
Right.
It's really a prohibitive as opposed to a exploratory kind of plan. And we get into, it's a very dangerous zone when you relax yourself to say, excuse me for using the word zone, but when you get yourself relaxed to, well, the zoning bylaw is going to deem the plan of the town. That's not the case at all. The plan is the vision, what you want your town to look like. Then the zoning establishes the structure to achieve that. But you have to have that idea, and I'm going to take an opportunity here. We're doing a rewrite of the zoning bylaw. We're also establishing some site design criteria, which I think is a very valuable tool, because I think it's unfair for us to have expectations of proponents of projects, and in this case the site design is more for non-residential than residential uses, well, entirely for non-residential uses, where without the proponent understanding what our expectations are of them, it's really kind of hard for them to know. Now, we've had a lot of local developers who have worked well with us, but when you get the national people, and we're starting to see some national people come in who have national branding, who have their vision for their image. Well, they're coming into a town, and you refer to the history and the 400th. Plymouth has it as a brand. I mean, both Bill Winterberg and myself have talked about this extensively at the planning board when we've discussed site design. Plymouth has a brand. When you say Plymouth, a picture develops in people's heads, like other places in the country. And I think it's important for us to have that kind of plan while also stewarding the, for lack of a better term, lowest common denominator for development. So I think, and that's very important, and I think we have to get away from just relying on zoning and the zoning bylaw to paint our picture.
So there is one more thing I think I'd like to do before, make sure we don't run out of time for this.
Well, we have about a minute to go here. So.
Healthy Plymouth. So the other thing that we're doing, along with all the other things we've talked about, is I'm the more or less townside coordinator for what's called Healthy Plymouth. And we're working very closely with, I want to say Jordan Hospital, but now they're
Israel Deaconess at Plymouth. Or
and so we're working very closely with the school system and with Jordan Hospital on Healthy Plymouth. And that is looking at everything the town does through the schools, through the hospital, planning, the town government itself, and the private sector of how to have a healthier Plymouth. And that's another very exciting thing, and maybe a topic for a future meeting, but looking at complete streets, ways to get children walking more, better food in the schools, better food in our stores too. So again, there's a great partnership, and the hospital's really been a great leader with us. And I know your previous speaker, Matt Moratori, is a very big, as you are, champion of this initiative. And so again, Healthy Plymouth is another very important thing we're working on in the department.
I think Healthy Plymouth, Healthy Communities is planning for a better quality of life. And when we have projects that are controversial, invariably people claim it's impacting their quality of life. Quality of life issues are incredibly important, and I think that's a big step in achieving a better quality of life. I absolutely agree with you. I would like to thank Lee Hartman, Director of Planning and Development, for taking this time to speak with us a little bit about his very broad involvement in what happens in this community. I would like to thank the audience for participating and listening in, and hopefully you've gotten some insight as to how we look at land use in the town of Plymouth. Lee, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.